Good evening, everybody, and welcome to The Trouble Begins, brought to you by the Mark Twain House and Museum in Hartford, Connecticut. My name is Jody Bryan. I'm the Director of Collections here at the museum, and I am so pleased to welcome you this evening. I have a couple admin things to take care of before we get going with Kevin tonight. First, I want to thank our sponsors. The Trouble Begins is always supported by the Center for Mark Twain Studies in Elmira, New York. Trouble Begins is also supported by Webster Bank, so we want to thank both of them for these programs. As most of you have already found, there is a chat feature. Feel free to chat amongst yourselves using that on the side of your screen. But if you have any questions for Kevin for the end of the program, please use the Ask a Question feature down at the bottom of the page, and we'll be sure to get to those during the Q&A at the end of the program. Now, right above that Ask a Question feature, there is a green button that says your support is vital to the Mark Twain House Museum. Please donate here. Just like every nonprofit, donations are a huge part of our support. So $1, $5, more dollars, any dollars really helps us support these programs as well as all the others at the museum, and just to keep our doors open for you to come and visit. We are open 7 days a week for tours, so we hope to welcome you to the house this summer. So that being said, without further ado, I will bring Kevin back onto screen and we'll get going. Kevin is a Mark Twain scholar based out of Texas. And there he is. Kevin, thank you so much for joining us again and showing us more of your collection. And I'm gonna pop off screen and leave you to it.
All right. Well, welcome everyone. I know we know why Jody called you all here, so I'm not going to rehearse all of the information that was given in the introduction that you've already read. We're going to look at things today that reflect the use of Mark Twain's name and image in advertising and promoting vendible products, as opposed to any kind of literary material. So let's get to work and look at the evidence. I've left things up on the top of the shelves where I generally store this kind of schlock, and we're going to go around and make a little clockwise tour of the library, looking at the things on the top of the shelves, at this end of the library anyway. And I will narrate as we go, and then we'll sit down at the table and go through some things in more detail. And at the end, we'll talk about what it all means. But right now, let's just examine the evidence. A lot of what you're seeing here are tourist items, statuettes, little figurines, all kinds of things sold by different groups and organizations depicting Mark Twain. Some of them are souvenirs, but other ones promote particular locations like Hannibal and Hartford and so on. This is a planter, actually, with Mark Twain's image. Here are some sewing thimbles. That's a finger puppet, a Mark Twain teapot from the Mark Twain home in Hannibal. You could get Mark Twain himself painting a fence, or you could get a ceramic limited edition of the Norman Rockwell painting of Tom, well, not Tom, but all of his victims painting the fence for him. And you could get it in a small or a large format. You could also get a bronze plaque or paperweight showing Twain painting his own fence. And here's a pith helmet from the Mark Twain National Forest in Missouri. There were also souvenir spoons issued in vast quantities, most of them for Hannibal. These date from 1902 up until about 1920. And here's one from Hartford that dates from 1916. It actually has Mark Twain in the handle of the spoon. So Hartford was being promoted as a place to visit and a place to gather souvenirs well before the Mark Twain home was preserved as a museum. The next thing we'll look at are Mark Twain cigar boxes and smoking paraphernalia. There are about a dozen different cigar boxes up here. They date from late 1870s. This is the very first Mark Twain cigar box. It uses a portrait by Warren of Boston that was taken of Twain in 1874. And it dates sometime between 1877, when this brand of cigar was registered. It also shows 4 scenes from Twain's works, and 1881. You'll notice that the big store sign behind it shows the same profile image of Mark Twain, and that dates from about 1881. Here's an image of Twain sitting on deck that was used in Following the Equator, and that cigar box dates from about 1901 or 1902. As we move this way, you're going to see some Tom Sawyer root beer. Behind there, and you can't see it, and I didn't have room to be able to get it out, there's some Mark Twain wine, there's some Mark Twain champagne, and there's even Mark Twain beer. If you visited Hannibal or even Elmira at the turn of the century and after, you could buy souvenir china. This china dates later, but this souvenir china from Mark Twain's cave, plus all of these dishes and saucers, plus all these little cups and glassware, and even this view of Elmira's Quarry Farm, they all date from about 1902 to the beginning of World War I, when the supply of china coming out of Dresden by this particular firm that made the souvenir china was cut off. Here are some Mark Twain dolls. There are a lot of Mark Twain dolls out there that have been made over the years. These are the most elaborate. They're ceramic dolls made by a woman in the 1970s. And what distinguishes them is that she included Injun Joe in the doll, along with Tom and Huck and Aunt Polly and Twain and Judge Thatcher and Becky and everybody else. And then she did something kind of strange. She included two Black children, a little boy and a little girl. And I called the lady. She was still alive about 10 years ago. And I called her and I asked her about those because they had names that made no sense. They were not characters from the novel. And I said, who are those little kids? Why are they there? And she said, well, I thought Tom and Huck, it would be nice for them to have some little Black children to play with. So she actually added some children, fictional children, to a fictional work. Here are some Toby mugs. Toby mugs are mugs that show a portrait of somebody, and they're usually wearing a top hat. They were made in England in the 19th century. There are a variety of Toby mugs made of Twain. These two decanters hold whiskey. If you decapitate Twain, there's whiskey in there and it smells pretty good. These date from, I think, the late 70s, so that whiskey has aged. Here's Tom and Huck. There's another Toby mug. And as we come around the corner, we're moving slowly so we don't pixelate. We'll see some more souvenir china. These 6 plates here in the middle are all dated from 1902 until about 1915, 1914. And those were souvenir china, mostly from Hannibal. There's Lover's Leap, The Boyhood Home, a collage, The Boyhood Home again. If we look upward, we see some Mark Twain games. We see some Mark Twain shirt collars. Mark Twain wrote a letter in 1883 to a man named Miller, giving him permission to name a shirt collar after him. And Miller later on sold his company to a man named Joe Elder, who founded a shirt company, an apparel company, which still is in business and makes Mark Twain shirts. We'll see more of that later. But these collars include the Langhorne, the Marquet, the Marksman, the Twain Ridge, the Pilot, the Sawyer, the Twain Tex, the Broadcast, I don't know what that would be, and the Detector, but these are all Mark Twain brand collars. On the end, you see a Mark Twain radio, a poster color set with some more colors for Tom Sawyer colors. On this side, we're looking at the game of authors, which was a very popular card game in the late 19th and early 20th century. It's still made today. All of these are 19th century versions of the game of authors, except for about a half dozen up there at the end. And they all include Mark Twain. Mark Twain started out as just another card in the deck, but eventually he became, in the 1880s, he was actually put on the lid of the deck and supplanted Shakespeare, Dickens, Whittier, Longfellow, and some other distinguished genteel authors who had been on the lid previously. As we move along the shelf in this direction, we see a Huckleberry Finn fishing game, but most of the games are associated with Tom Sawyer. Tom Sawyer was much the more popular book in the early 20th century. The fishing game is rather dangerous. It's a board game and you move around the board. And when you land on the right square, you get an opportunity to catch a fish. And you do that with your fishing pole and you tap at the center of the game board where there's a little spring contraption set up with some fish. When you tap them, if you tap it the right way, good hand-eye coordination, the fish will pop out. I decided to test this game, and I tapped it, and the fish went flying past me into the wall and put a hole in the sheetrock behind me. The fish are about 4 to 6 inches long, and they're made out of very hard plastic, maybe celluloid. It's actually, I think it's a hard plastic. Very dangerous game. The Keystone toy company, I don't think, is in business anymore. The instructions with the game said that the child with the most fish wins. I think it was really a matter of the child that still had vision in one eye at the end of the game was probably the winner. You see a chalk set, a poster set, a stamping set. There's a slate with chalk to draw on. There's even just a game of Tom Sawyer, the finger painting set. And then you see Huck Finn chocolates. So you see that the Tom Sawyer games outnumber the Huck Finn games by about 5 to 1. You could also buy Tom Sawyer crayons, Tom Sawyer chalk, and Tom Sawyer writing instruments individually outside of the game. There were other board games that came along. One of the very first games associated with Mark Twain is his Memory Builder. The Memory Builder had a long set of instructions that Mark Twain wrote out himself. It's a very dull game. You'll notice it goes 1 to 100. You play it by century. You choose a century, and then you open up your box of pins and you start naming events and dates. And if you have the date and the event correct, it could be the reign of a king or a queen, or Columbus discovering America in 1492, if you were doing the 15th century. And you try to name as many different names and dates as you can, and whoever names the most wins. You have some help with a list of dates and events that Mark Twain compiled and put in a little leaflet that went with the game. And the game was a bust. It came out in the 1880s, 1891 actually, and it was a terrible game, very, very dull. I've never seen one that was used. A stock of them turned up in the 1950s, or actually I think 1949, and entered the market. The game you see up here at the top is The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn, a board game that came along in the 1920s. It's a lot more fun to play than the Mark Twain Memory Builder. And this game at the bottom is an interesting one. It was produced by Parker Brothers in 1888. They began advertising it a year later. It sold pretty well. It came out in later editions. It's called The Innocents Abroad. And you notice that's not the name of Twain's book, The Innocents Abroad, NTS. What Parker Brothers did, they did not license or get permission from Twain. They simply ripped off the title of Twain's best-selling book. And we sometimes forget that The Innocents Abroad and Tom Sawyer were Twain's best-selling books during his lifetime. It's a board game. You use a spinner to take turns, has a set of rules. You move around the board, but none of the places that you visit and none of the people involved in the game have anything to do with Twain's books at all. Back to smoking. Here's a banner asking you to buy Huckleberry Finn cigars. That banner is linen. It's been mounted on a museum board on cotton for preservation. Researching it, I discovered it was made in Cape Girardeau, Missouri in the summer of 1900. Apparently, Huckleberry Finn cigars were not a best-selling cigar. They were advertised very briefly that summer, and then they vanished altogether from the record. Next, we're going to look at Mark Twain bookends up here at the top. You see one up here at the top that's handmade, one in plaster, another one that's made in some kind of plastic. As we come around the corner, you'll see one that's made of bronze and brass. It shows Tom Sawyer with Mark Twain. Most of them are simply portraits of Twain. Bronmet in the 1920s made that one showing Twain's portrait. You now see one in bronze. It's like the one that you saw in plaster. The one over here shows the Mark Twain birthplace cabin, and then a polychrome bookends that show Tom and Huck, a set of wooden bookends that show Twain by himself, and then the rest are just bookends, more of the same. Next, we're going to look at a food item, and there'll be more food items later. This is Mark Twain flour. This is a cloth sack that would hold 100 pounds of Mark Twain flour. They also made sacks for 25-pound, 10-pound, and 5-pound bags of flour. This particular flour is registered in 1900, and the company went out of business about 1950, shortly after World War II. Folklore also plays a part in Twain's image, and modern folklore. He's still a subject of interest to modern folklorists. A talented artist named Tom Haney made this, he calls them automata or automatons of Twain. It's kind of a marionette in a setting. And Twain is sitting here with his spyglass. He can steer the wheel, steering a steamboat. He can dance around. He sees a Sawyer. He gets all excited and goes, oh my God, I've got to steer around that Sawyer to get away from that snag. Oh my God. There's a problem with this if you haven't spotted it already. The wheel is a little bit small for a steamboat. Twain is elderly and dressed in a white suit. Twain was never a steamboat pilot at that age. And so he's also on the Ohio River, not the Mississippi River. Twain spent time on the Missouri River, and he spent a lot of time on the Mississippi River. I don't think he ever piloted anything on the Ohio River. Here's what a steamboat captain really, or a steamboat pilot really looked like. It was a great big wheel, and you wore a cap, and quite different from the way he's depicted in folklore. However, I cannot overemphasize the fact that when it comes to folklore, you don't hold a high standard to historical accuracy. In fact, the point of folklore is to take kind of a montage, a conglomeration of all of the elements of a person's character and combine them into a single work of art. So you have Twain in his old age, in his white suit, the familiar image of Twain, and you have him operating a steamboat with a nice background. It's quite a work of art. Back to smoking again. We have gigantic Mark Twain cigars. We also have smaller Mark Twain cigars. You also have Mark Twain smoking tobacco. Pugs were a very popular way to advertise products in the late 19th century. And so they used pugs to advertise Mark Twain smoking tobacco. This is a counter sign right here that was designed to sit on a counter in a tobacco shop or a department store to promote cigars. This is the most familiar Mark Twain cigar box that dates much later. It was registered in 1913, and the company that made it kept in business into the late 1930s, possibly as late as 1940s. And that shows a box of cigars open. Here's an actual box of those cigars with the cigars still in the box. And if we shut the box, you'll see this embossed gold label. And here's the embossing tool that was used to actually produce that label by the company that produced these cigars. Walt Disney also got into the act. The Mark Twain riverboat at Disneyland, I think Disneyland, you could ride on that boat and you could buy a captain's cap as a souvenir. There are a lot of different hats associated with Mark Twain. How about a beanie advertising Huckleberry Finn soda sold in bottles? And this dates from 1924 when that particular soda was registered. Here's a bottle cap for that same soda. I'm making Mark Twain do his job here, holding another Mark Twain doll that's flexible and can move around. And I'm having him help out today a little bit with the beanie. Dr. Pepper got into the act when the Paramount film of Huckleberry Finn was produced in 1931. There was a promotion with Dr. Pepper. If you bought a ticket to the movie, you also got a free bottle of Dr. Pepper, and they put these caps on those bottles of Dr. Pepper. And if you needed help opening your bottles, you could use your bottle opener from the Mark Twain cave. And then we'll look at some Mark Twain apparel now. Mark Twain shirts, which I mentioned earlier. The Elder Manufacturing Company established, the company was established in 1908. They began making the shirts in the teens, and they still make them today. They make school uniforms and all kinds of stuff. You could also buy a Huck Finn slingshot, even though Huck never used a slingshot. You could buy a Mark Twain pipe, although that does not resemble any pipes that Mark Twain actually smoked. That was made in 1930. It's the earliest souvenir Mark Twain pipe I've ever seen. You could also buy a Tom Sawyer harmonica, even though Tom did not play the harmonica. Remember, historical accuracy has nothing to do when it comes to commercial exploitation of Mark Twain's name. The Sebastian Miniature Company started in the 1940s and was active into the 1960s or 70s. And they made small ceramic souvenir statues that beginning with, for Mark Twain anyway, beginning in 1949 with a little limited edition of the Mark Twain home, which was sold in Hannibal. You could also get Mark Twain when they ended the series in 1962. And in between, you could get Aunt Polly, You could get Tom at his fence. You could get Becky at her desk. You could get her father, Judge Thatcher. You could get Huck swimming. And this is quite notable, you could get Jim on the raft, and he's guiding the raft using the sweep, which is the rudder or the paddle that was used to control the raft. And Jim, what's remarkable about this, first of all, is that Jim shows up at all, because Jim is ignored by most Mark Twain dolls. There aren't any Jim products out there that I'm aware of, but he was included in the Sebastian miniatures. And he's not caricatured. He's not a stereotype. There's nothing racist that I can depict in his depiction. He's dressed pretty much as he would have been in the novel. And he's doing exactly what he did in the novel. He's guiding the raft down the river. So that's quite notable that Jim makes an appearance here. You could also measure time with a Mark Twain clock, actually a Huck Finn clock. You could also measure time with a with a Mark Twain watch, a pocket watch. And if you turn it around there, you can see Mark Twain's name engraved on that watch right by my thumb, right there. Twain invested $5,000 in that company. He found out that it was a fraud. Webster got him into it. Webster got him back out of it. He got $3,600 of his money back, and I think he got a note for the difference. The actual numbers there, looking at different sources, are a little foggy. But he got in, he got out, felt lucky to have gotten out. Mark Twain is associated with different places. You see paperweights. This one for St. Louis, when Mark Twain piloted a steamboat in 1902, very, very briefly. A paperweight from Quarry Farm from the turn of the century, showing the porch at Quarry Farm that many of us are familiar with. The Tom Blankenship home in Hannibal that shows the home of the original Huck Finn. And of course, the familiar boyhood home in Hannibal, also from the turn of the century. This paperweight is made of clay from the Mark Twain cave, and it was made when it was still legal to take clay from the cave. That would be a violation of federal law nowadays. If you wanted to form a Mark Twain club, you could form a Mark Twain club. This is from 1901 from New York City. I think the earliest Mark Twain club I've traced was in Ireland in the 1880s, and there have been several clubs formed since. I would remind everyone that what you're seeing here is only the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot more material out there. There's a drawer full of badges, and these are just the small things that I keep in here. Odds and ends, a Barlow knife, a badge, souvenirs, mostly from the Mark Twain home in Hannibal, an ashtray, some pens and pencils, some tape measures, another Mark Twain clock made by, or watch made by somebody else altogether. Some more Mark Twain materials, another can opener, all kinds of Mark Twain medals and badges and coins have been issued, gold, silver, platinum, you name it. And also larger plaques and paperweights have been issued over the years. Back to the Mark Twain Shirt Company, they made apparel. You could get Tom Sawyer pajamas. You could get Tom Sawyer everything. You could choose swatches to get the kind of material that you wanted in your shirt or your. They made shirts. They made just about everything. They made school uniforms, so a ruler with a built-in pencil sharpener made sense. But they also sold dress shirts, so a tape measure for a tailor also made sense. In 1919, 1 year after they registered their Mark Twain shirt brand, they made a tape measure as a souvenir. They also had, and what kid doesn't need nice sharp razors or a bottle opener, a corkscrew to get at the booze. They also made shoes, so you could buy Mark Twain shoes. And by the way, I'm wearing a Mark Twain shirt. This garish shirt that I'm wearing is called a Calypso. It was made by the Mark Twain Shirt Company in the 1950s or 60s. And that's not the only thing they made. They made, takes a second, yep. They also made Mark Twain pants. I'm not wearing any Mark Twain pants now. And there's the label for Mark Twain pants. They advertised Tom Sawyer products in every way they could think of. You could buy a Tom Sawyer whistle, and it works. You could also get a Mark Twain blowout for Tom Sawyer apparel. And to hold up your Mark Twain pants, of course, you need a belt with a Mark Twain belt buckle. That's one of about a dozen Mark Twain belt buckles of various types that I have. Back to those card sets we talked about earlier. Card sets, this is when Twain was on the cards, but he got moved, he got promoted and got onto the covers of the cards. And so that's a significant move when he replaced Shakespeare and Dickens, Longfellow, and some others. And if you weren't satisfied with your Mark Twain shirt, your Mark Twain pants, your Mark Twain belt buckle, your Mark Twain shoes, they did not make Mark Twain underwear or socks, but they did make Mark Twain mink stoles. Clara, when she moved to Detroit, sold the rights to make furs. So they had furs by Mark Twain. That's a mink stole. I can't get Donna to wear it out in public. But you can actually get a mink stole. I'm not going to model it. Twain himself wrote a letter to the Remington Typewriter Company. We all know about Twain's use of typewriters, having a manuscript copied for Tom Sawyer and sent to England using a typewriter. He also had copies of his manuscripts made for Lifeline, Mississippi and Huckleberry Finn on a typewriter. Twain wrote to Remington saying, please do not use my name in any way. Please do not even divulge the fact that I own a machine. I have entirely stopped using the typewriter. And he goes on to say why he didn't want him to use the name. So in 1877, the Remington Typewriter, her sewing machine company, which made typewriters, they immediately used his name, his letter, and they even included a sample of actual typing from their machine in their advertisement. Twain also wrote with a pen. This is Twain's own pen. This is his H.M. Smith pen from 1868, which he used until about 1880. He replaced that pen with a Mackinnon pen. This is not Twain's own Mackinnon pen. It's just a Mackinnon pen. The Mackinnon pen used a wire, kind of like a ballpoint pen nowadays. Some people consider it an early precursor to the ballpoint pen. Twain used those pens, but he never wrote the companies any kind of letter praising their product, so they never used his name in advertising. But when it came to the Paul Wirt Pen Company, Twain did. The Paul Wirt pen, again, a little pen that rolls around on the desk. Twain wrote them a letter of praise in 1883. And when they put out this little advertising booklet, they quoted from Twain's letter, saying it's an absolutely perfect reservoir pen. Twain wrote them again in 1898, praising their pen. That time they included his picture in color and gilt. They reproduced his letter in facsimile, praising their pen. In 1903, he used this pen from 1868 to about 1880. He used the Mackinnon pen for about 2 years, from 1880 to 1882, maybe 1879. He used the Paul Wirt pen from 1882, more or less, till around the turn of the century. He experimented with a few other pens, but in 1903, he got a hold of a Conklin pen, and he really liked it because it had a filler. You fill the pen by turning a little dial, pressing that in to express the air, releasing it to suck in the ink, and then you lock it back and now you can write. It was a very clean, easy pen to refill. He liked it because you couldn't roll it off a desk. A little crescent would stop the pen from rolling off a desk like these other pens. And he wrote the company saying he thought they made a wonderful pen, and the company immediately turned around and used his letter in the Conklin advertising. You can still buy a Conklin pen today called the Mark Twain model. And it's a very fine writing instrument, although the pen they sell is not actually a reproduction of the pen that Twain used because it has some features on it that didn't come until later. Twain also, back to smoking again, Duke Cigarette Company used Twain's image in their advertising. They also used Edgar Allan Poe and Longfellow and other authors in their advertising, but Twain featured prominently. Those cards and little biographies were put in things like cigarette papers like this. They were also put in packs of cigarettes, which were much smaller in those days. They also issued Twain in a card set of 50 different people, poor boys who made good. It was the name of the series, I think, or something like that. And they made those cards. They also issued a triple card featuring Twain with 2 other writers. I think that's Webster and West. And here's a card for that original Twain cigar back from 1877 to 1881, showing that same image of Twain. Twain also was used by the Mogul Cigarette Company, and they issued 5 trade cards, each one with a quote by Mark Twain. The only problem being Twain never said those things. Those are not Mark Twain quotes. I don't know where they got them, made them up, whatever. But now you're starting to see where this all leads. In the 1880s, somebody produced this ceramic humidor, and it includes a quote by Mark Twain that says, "I cultivate my flowers and burn my weed, Mark Twain." Except Mark Twain never said that. It was an English minister who actually said that, who was a popular orator, but not Mark Twain. Mark Twain's name is also associated with travel. He wrote a lot of travel books. So you think of Mark Twain and transportation. So you could get a Mark Twain motorboat. There's an owner's manual for one. You could ride the Mark Twain Zephyr, a streamlined streamlined train that operated in Illinois and Missouri and actually made stops in Hannibal. That's a timetable and a plan showing the route from 1937. Twain also rode in a Buick. The fellow that was driving that Buick was killed in a wreck about 6 months after that photograph was taken, but he was a race car driver for Buick. But Buick took the photograph showing Twain in their car and used that as an advertising postcard later on. A coffee company came up with the idea of using a Mark Twain steamboat as a premium, and you could save up your coupons, send them into, I don't remember the coffee company's name, and get a set of prints. And you had to cut out all the pieces and fold them and bend them and glue them together. And you could use threads and toothpicks and make a model of a steamboat. And it's actually a pretty good steamboat, and the wheels turn and everything works. You could cut out all the little flags. It's quite an elaborate thing. Twain also promoted, and last but not least, a street token from Hannibal to ride a streetcar in Hannibal, Missouri. He also had Twain writing prefaces to other people's books. He did that a number of times. He wrote a preface to Pedro Carolino's book, The New Guide to Portuguese, because he thought it was just an utterly charming book, and he convinced Osgood to publish it. He wrote a preface to his friend Dan DeQuille's book, The Big Bonanza, that came out in 1876. He wrote a nice letter praising Anne of Green Gables. So when the next book by Montgomery came out, Anne of Avonlea, they used an excerpt from Mark Twain's letter praising Anne of Green Gables to advertise it in this little die-cut book-shaped flyer to promote the book. Twain also wrote a letter praising a memory system by a guy named Loisette. And when he published he had published a couple of books, but when he published a guide to his memory system, he included Twain's letter promoting it. Twain wrote a letter praising the Jubilee Singers. And when the book was published about the Jubilee Singers, they made damn sure that Mark Twain's letter of praise was included in that book in 1875. Twain wrote to Will Clemens, who was in fact distantly related, and asked him he refused to write an introduction for Will Clemens' book. So when Will Clemens did Twain one better, he just put Twain's letter in the introduction to his book. A friend of Twain who wrote under the name Gath, his actual name was Townsend, wrote a book called Tales of the Chesapeake. And in the first edition, there's no letter from Twain, but in the third edition, Twain had written a letter praising the book, and they used that letter to promote the third edition. Howell's Story of a Country Town is a well-known book. It was printed in Kansas. Twain wrote a letter of praise, and of course, they mentioned that on a label that they stuck into later copies of the book. It's a first edition, but as soon as they got Twain's letter, they printed up those cards and started sticking them in there. Twain also was used in other ways. This fellow produced a long series of a big collection of sketches, and he included some by Twain, including some that were not by Twain. Twain sued him. The guy couldn't reprint those sketches, but he reprinted the one that wasn't by Twain, and then he wrote a preface to the second edition and described the book as having a $10,000 sketch by Mark Twain. Twain had written some articles for the Overland Monthly. When they couldn't sell all their magazines, they reissued them in a twilight form with a fake cover called Overland Sketches, and they included Mark Twain, who got second billing to Bret Harte. Twain also ended up on the covers of books. At first, he was included among other authors. There he is with Bret Harte above him again. Here he is on the front cover of a book, collection of writings. Here he is with a group of authors. for the Library of Wit and Humor, but he got promoted to be the single author on the Library of Wit and Humor. On Authors of Our Day in Their Homes, he was featured by himself. Then he was featured in a book in color. Then he got featured in a book full length. When books started appearing in dust jackets, Twain soon appeared on a dust jacket. And Twain even came back from the dead to appear on a dust jacket in 1917. Twain also promoted his scrapbook. This is an example of Mark Twain's scrapbook, which was a self-pacing scrapbook. You could paste things into it. You didn't have to use glue. That was advertised with a Twain letter in broadside form, leaflets printed in all different colors, fold-out leaflets and brochures. They even advertised it on their envelopes and on their invoices. Here, sit down. And they advertised it as well on Punch Brothers Punch, the Mark Twain scrapbook on the back cover. They also advertised food products. Carson's Chocolate uses Mark Twain's image on a little trade card. You could buy Tom Sawyer sardines, as if Tom Sawyer ever ate sardines or went fishing for sardines. A fellow selling watermelon came up with the idea of issuing a postcard with Mark Twain's endorsement of watermelons. Anheuser-Busch promoted malt Nutrine by including a Mark Twain story that he did not write. Mark Twain oysters were also featured. I think we missed the malt Nutrine. And Mark Twain oysters, right here, they included a story, again, not by Mark Twain. There was an 1898 street fair held in Hannibal that featured Mark Twain and the Boyhood Home. There was also the Mark Twain Hotel. There were many Mark Twain hotels. There's one in Hannibal. Here's one in St. Louis. Here's one in San Francisco, which is still in business today. Here's one in Hawaii. Here's a leaflet promoting the Mark Twain volcano in Hawaii. And here's Ontario Beach, using an open letter to Mark Twain. Mark Twain was also used to promote a stud horse. If you always thought that Mark Twain was a stud, well, here's the proof. Mark Twain was available for stud along with a horse named Top. He was 15 3/4 hands high. This was dates from about 1875. There you could get Mark Twain coal. You could get a Pullman car. Mark Twain was used along with Thomas Edison and Teddy Roosevelt to advertise the Pullman cars. Twain wrote a letter praising the Cunard line in 1873, and they quickly began using it to promote their line. The North German Lloyd line also used Mark Twain's letter praising their ships to promote themselves at the 1893 World's Fair. And none other than Buffalo Bill reprinted Twain's horse's tail in all of his brochures. Mark Twain wrote a letter on accident insurance that got reprinted pretty quickly. When Mark Twain published Sketches New and Old, the back cover was blank, but soon it got used. When they couldn't sell copies, they began selling them to Aetna Life Insurance, and they put their ads on the back. Twain also supported various causes. One of the causes that he supported was the Lincoln Farm Association that was going to preserve Lincoln's birthplace home. And if you donated something to them, they would send you a certificate rolled up in a little mailer. He also got his name on the Congo Reform Association, and he wrote King Leopold's soliloquy to promote their cause. He also supported the Actors Fund of America, and he stayed in a booth during their fair and autographed copies of his book, Tom Sawyer. There's a press badge for somebody at that fund. He also had buttons made for kids in a class. There were 15 disabled students in New York City. They had written to him asking, the teacher wrote to him asking if they could do something to help out in their class. And he had Ashcroft go out and make some buttons. They called themselves the Little Men. Twain also opposed Prohibition. So when Prohibition came along years later, a fellow had a card printed up opposing Prohibition using Mark Twain's words. Mark Twain supported Mother's Day, and an organization in 1907 that was promoting Mother's Day used Mark Twain's letter to promote it. Twain, along with Jean, opposed animal experimentation, and so he supported the Anti-Vivisection Society, and they used his name to oppose the use of animal experimentation. Twain also supported the women's suffrage, and they used Twain's letter to support suffrage 10 years before suffrage was actually approved by Congress. And they even used posters to promote, using Twain's quote, saying he would like to see the ballot in the hands of every woman. Twain was also an investor in Plasmon, and they used his name in their advertising. And Twain also, of course, we know of all the problems he had with copyright and piracy. He was a member of the American Copyright League. I have an archive of their papers, and he did a lot of work for them, and they used his letters to promote their cause. Twain also was interested in getting rid of Tammany Hall in New York City, and he wrote a book called Edmund Burke on Croker and Tammany. And this is an archive of other folders, leaflets issued by the Society of Order of Acorns, of which Twain was briefly a member, and he supported their candidates. And those are their leaflets. But Twain, they did a book for him, a little booklet. And finally, Twain was used on trade cards. Most of the trade cards that you've seen show Twain with trade cards that were printed for particular companies. But there was another type of trade card out there called a stock card. And these cards were blank cards that any company could order. And when you ordered it, you could then print your own advertising on the card. And if you look closely at that card, you'll see they got his name wrong, S.H. Clemens, and they even misspelled Clemens. It gets worse. Someone came along and thought they would improve it. They erased the mistake and corrected it to S.M. Clemens. At least they got the last name spelled right. The card was issued in a series with a lot of other people in the series. And Twain himself, they advertised every kind of product you can imagine. We see sewing machines, we see clothing, we see furniture stores, we see all kinds of manufactured goods. Let's see, I'll use the other hand here. Dry good and fancy goods, another company of dry goods, another company of dry and fancy goods, clothing and tailoring, another tailor, watches, a barber shop, a pharmacy. When you get to the end, let's skip to the end here, you get all through the rest of these, and you actually end up with a fire department at one point. There we go, gas fitters and a fire department. They also had a series of cards called the Baby Series. It was a large series of cards. I think it had 16 different portraits in it. One was Mark Twain, the funny baby. Another one was the first baby, which was which was Charles Darwin. The next one was Ulysses S. Grant, the contented baby. Darwin, of course, was the first baby. And then there was the man baby, Dr. Mary Walker. And if you don't know about Mary Walker, find out about her. She's a remarkable, probably the most remarkable woman of the 19th century. She was a cross-dresser, but not for the reasons you might suspect. She was a cross-dresser because she was a farm girl, and you could stay cleaner and work better dressed in men's clothing wearing pants than you could if you were wearing a petticoat. And again, the card was used to advertise a variety of products. It came as a blank, but then you could print your own business on it. So druggists used it. A little magazine used it. I don't know what the Palace of Luxury was, but whatever they sold, a harness maker, another publisher, silk and felt hats, clothing and furnishings, and parlor organs of all things. But it gets worse. When Twain fired Ralph Ashcroft in 1909, what did Ashcroft do? He turned right around and came up with a fake Twain letter. He concocted it himself, put it on his own letterhead, put Twain's signature on it, and sent it off or sold it to Players Navy Cut Tobacco. And so here is Twain being used to promote a tobacco that he never used, using a letter that he never wrote. It's just a fraud by Ralph Ashcroft. And finally, that gets us to the present day. And I'll end it with a sign that I made myself. It says, no civilization can be perfect until exact equality between man and woman is included. Mark Twain, 1895. It's an entry from Mark Twain's notebook, not from his published writings. Donna and I participated in the 2017 Women's March, and I carried that sign. I thought it would be good for people to see Mark Twain in a different way. So that concludes our tour. I'll just wrap it up by saying this. Mark Twain, all of this material, you're probably wondering, well, very nice, but what does it mean? We all know, I think most of us are readers of Mark Twain and are familiar with his writings, what he says, what he means, what he thinks about political items, political issues, cultural issues, literature. But we have to remember that the people who see all of this kind of material, many of them have never read Twain's works. They don't know anything other than what they've heard secondhand. Maybe they've seen some quotes on a t-shirt or some quotes online, but they have not read very many of Twain's works. Maybe they've read Tom Sawyer. So a lot of people looking at this material would think that Tom Sawyer did fish for sardines, or that he did drink root beer, or that he did play a harmonica, or they think that Huck ate chocolates or played with a slingshot. They have no idea that these things don't really represent Mark Twain's writings and his thoughts. They're just part of the public image, part of the brand, and it's not really an accurate representation of what Twain wrote or what he stood for. But in the popular mind, this is how Twain is seen. This is a pretty good overview of the kind of things that are out there. But again, it's the tip of the iceberg. There's a massive materials out there. This is what we could show you in 45 or 50 minutes. And with that, I'll turn everything back over to Jody and entertain questions.
That was wonderful, Kevin. Thank you so much for yet again allowing us into your home to see your collection. We have a lot of questions from the audience, so I'm just going to dive right into them. The first one is, do you have any Mark Twain Christmas tree ornaments?
Yes, that's about all I can say. I can't dig them out now. It's very hard digging this stuff out. I keep a lot of that kind of material in boxes and stored away. My focus is on books and letters and literary material. A lot of this kind of thing ends up in file cabinets and ends up in storage. And so there's just a mass of this material out there. But there are ornaments. Most of them have been sold either at Hannibal or at Hartford over the years.
Yep, I will say we have some in the gift shop, so go buy some.
I guess support the gift shop.
Yep. I guess a follow-up to that is, if you do celebrate Christmas, do you put them on your own Christmas tree?
We have. There are 2 Mark Twain nutcrackers that actually exist, and we put those out at Christmas. They're pretty bizarre. I had a collector friend who told me he had a Mark Twain nutcracker, and I said, "Oh, I've got that nutcracker." And he started describing his nutcracker, and his nutcracker was different from my nutcracker. And we realized, oh my God, there's 2 different Mark Twain nutcrackers out there. And so the race was on, and I finally found an example of the other kind of Mark Twain nutcracker. Only a collector would get into that kind of completist mode of thinking. But yeah, there's just a mass of material out there, and some of it is associated with Christmas, which was a holiday that Twain did not particularly like late in life.
No. All right, so the next one is, what is the strangest use of Mark Twain's image in advertising and or in a souvenir that you've come across?
My favorite, and the one that I think is really strange, is the one that I showed you. It doesn't show his image because obviously Mark Twain was not a horse, but Mark Twain is a stud horse. I think that's right up there. I think that's pretty bizarre.
Yeah.
Someone named their horse after Mark Twain. I also have a statute from the 1880s in Oregon where there was a change of name, a legal change of name, and it involved a young boy whose parents had named him Mark Twain. I don't remember what his last name was, but his first name was Mark, his middle name was Twain, his last name was Smith or Miller or something. That's pretty strange too. But I think Mark Twain, the stud horse, 15 3/4 hands tall, is pretty odd.
Oh, that's amazing. All right. So in that same line of questioning, where did it go? Is there a Twain item that is your great white whale, something that you know of but have never been able to track down?
Yes. I showed you the beanie from Huckleberry Finn Soda from 1924, I think, maybe 26. I think it's 24. The beanie has to be very rare. I've never seen another one. And I have a bottle cap for that kind of drink. I don't have the bottle. And soda pop bottles from the 1920s can't be all that rare. I've seen lots of them. I've contacted many collectors of soda pop bottles. None of them have ever heard of the Huckleberry Finn Soda. I've contacted the author of 2 price guides, collector guides to soda bottles, and they've never heard of it. Donna and I go out antiquing, flea markets and places like that. We haven't during the pandemic, but we used to, and we've never seen one. I have the Tom Sawyer bottle cap and the Tom Sawyer bottles. Those show up from time to time. But the bottle from the 1920s for Huckleberry Finn Soda just hasn't shown up. I even have a receipt for a store up in New England in the about 1931, I think, showing that they bought a whole case of Huckleberry Finn Soda. So the stuff was out there, it was issued, it was advertised on the beanie, there's bottle caps for it. Have never seen the bottle. If it showed up, it wouldn't be particularly valuable. It's never shown up.
Oh, that's so weird. Well,
it's
one
weird.
day.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, so next one. If Mark Twain could be brought back to life, what do you think his reaction would be to your collection?
Probably
kind of a hypothetical.
My mental stability. Probably would not want to hang around. I think he would be flattered that we were collecting books and photographs and letters, just as people do for many, many authors. Mm-hmm. I don't know what he would think of all of the use of his name and image in advertising and promoting other people's products. Twain, during his lifetime, didn't seem to pay very much attention to that. Ashcroft registered his name. Twain himself registered his name as a trademark, but only to protect his literary works. He didn't really think of it in terms of exploiting it commercially. That idea, he got upset when people copied his works, but only late in life did Twain really come to terms, I think, with his celebrity and the commercial exploitation of his celebrity. And that was mostly through Ralph Ashcroft. I think more than Twain himself. Ashcroft seemed to be the prime mover there. So I think Twain would have a lot of catching up to do. Because we have to remember that in his lifetime, the concept of celebrity was relatively new. And I think Twain was well aware of the value of his name and understood how it could be exploited because he used it to exploit things like the Mark Twain scrapbook. But in terms of other people using his name and image, I think he probably thought all publicity was good publicity, and that helped him sell his books. And it was probably also very difficult to chase all those people down. It was a little easier to protect your intellectual property through copyright than it was to try to chase people down using your image or a trademark name to sell, whatever kind of stuff that they were trying to sell.
Yeah. All right. So next one. This says, when Twain wrote letters to companies praising their products, was he anticipating getting complimentary merchandise or services in return?
I think he might have. Conklin Pens sent him, when he wrote them praising their 1903 model pen, they sent him a 1904 model pen. I know that there's one of the Conklin pens preserved there in Hartford, and I know there's another one preserved at the Byrd Library in New York Public Library. But I don't know I don't know if he wrote the letters expecting to be comped with free products. I think he wrote some of those letters knowing full well that they would probably use those letters to advertise their products. And I think that he knew that when he saw his name used in advertising like that, it simply spread his name and helped him sell more books. Again, I don't think Twain, he was very protective of his intellectual property. I don't think he saw the full potential for his trademark. Right.
Kind of an original influencer, but not quite harnessing it the way they do today.
Yeah, and you just have to remember times were different then. It wasn't like it is now. Now we've got over 100 years of experience dealing with trademarks and celebrity endorsements. In Twain's day, that was all very new. That was a new concept. And Twain was pretty much on the bleeding edge of all of that.
All right, so this one says, do you have any idea of the dollar amount of the royalties Twain or his estate or Clara or whoever got for these representations? Do you know if he charged any prices for the things he did agree to put his picture on them, or were they all kind of free out there?
I know he made about $12,000 on the scrapbook in the first few years. I forget the time period. It may be the first year or 2 or 3. I don't know of payments that he received for the use of his name or image elsewhere. I suspect there were very, very few. I've got letters of Twain giving people permission to use his name to promote something, but there's never the mention of money or payment. I think that what you would have to do to research that is to start with the Mark Twain papers and go through the law firm, Chamberlain, the law firm that represented the Mark Twain Company, especially in the early days when they were licensing some of these names. The Mark Twain shirt, or the Elder Manufacturing that made Mark Twain shirts, did license Tom Sawyer Apparel in 1918. They trademarked it themselves in 1914. I don't know how that works if you trademark something and then you don't license it for 4 years later. I suspect there was more going behind the scenes there. But I think if you were able to go through the papers of the law firm that represented the Mark Twain Company in those years, that you would be able to get an idea of what they were paid. For example, I don't know what Clara was paid to give permission for the Mark Twain furs in Detroit. Yeah.
All right. What is the most recent image you have seen? Or I'm assuming this question is asking the most recent use of his image.
Oh gosh. I can't think of one that I've seen recently. I'm sorry, my wife had an idea.
I know, I heard her whisper there.
Coffee mugs.
Oh, coffee mugs, yeah. This coffee mug actually has good thing. It's a Mark Twain coffee mug for the Mark Twain Cave. I have 60 more of them. Not like this, all different.
Oh, wow.
And those things keep showing up. When I bought the Nick Karanovich collection that didn't go to auction, there were about 3,000 items in the collection. I kept about 300 of them. And 50 of those were Mark Twain coffee mugs, of which I only had 3 or 4 at the time. I've added to that collection since then, I'm embarrassed to say, and now have a little over 60 of them. And so those would probably be the most recent that I've seen, where they slap Mark Twain's name on a t-shirt or a coffee mug. That's where you see it used today. You'll see his name stuck on a t-shirt with a quote, sometimes a quote of something he said, sometimes not. And you'll see coffee mugs with his image on them.
And if you would like your own t-shirt with a quote on it, you can visit our shop because we have plenty of those.
That's right.
Here's a little bit of a different question, but who dusts all the items that we're seeing here? You or Donna?
I put all of these out today in anticipation of this tour. Up here on this floor, it doesn't gather very much dust because it stays closed and there's not a lot of traffic in and out of the library. The material you see out here on the desk is mostly stored in Mylar sleeves and stored behind glass on shelves in document boxes. And so it doesn't have an opportunity to gather very much dust. The two enemies of a library like this are sunlight and dust. And books and papers and photographs are fairly easy to curate. Three-dimensional objects are much more problematic. They're made of so many different materials, cellophane, leather, different types of metal, different types of material that are not necessarily friendly to each other, weird glues, especially for a lot of the products made in Japan after the war. And so a lot of those materials are very tricky to curate, and you have to protect them from dust and sunlight. So unlike books which sit on a shelf, even though they're behind glass and protected, the kind of material here usually ends up in a mylar folder in a box protected from sunlight and dust. So it doesn't get that opportunity to, doesn't need to be dusted that much, I guess.
Thankfully, it's a big job. All right, so this one says, do you have any items from Twain's time in Reading, especially related to the library he founded there?
I have postcards promoting the Mark Twain Library in Reading. No other objects that I can think of off the top of my head that come from Reading or come from the Mark Twain Library. I have books from his library that came out of the Reading Library when they made a horrible mistake and sold a bunch of books from their library back in 1952, 3, 4, and sold a bunch of books that had belonged to Mark Twain without realizing they were selling original books that Mark Twain had donated to their library. Those got scattered into the marketplace, and I've recovered a few of those. But material promoting the Mark Twain Library, I only have, I think, postcards mostly.
One question that went in, I see it in the comments instead, is what is your most favorite item in the collection? Not necessarily most valuable, but most favorite.
I like the folk art thing, which I acquired fairly recently. It was made in 2003 and sold to a folk art collector. Came up for sale a couple of years ago. Well, last year, in fact. I looked at it and thought, oh my God, I don't think that fits in. What a silly thing. The more I looked at it, the more it kind of grew on me. And so I bought it. Bought it for an awfully good price, a fraction of what it was sold for when it was made new. And I then started researching modern folk art, and especially the folk art by the man who made that, Tom Haney. He has a website, and he makes a lot of remarkable things, and he makes custom things for people. But that's maybe at the top of the list, a fairly recent acquisition. It's key operated, so it's kind of fun to see Twain, and also the incongruity of Twain in his old age wearing a white suit, guiding a steamboat on the Ohio River using a small wheel. But as I said earlier, you have to judge folk art in a different category by itself than you would, say, documents and letters and historical relics. But absolutely. I like that a lot. I think it's kind of a cool thing. It's really goofy. That's the part of it.
Yeah, no, that's fun. I mean, and we all know that you have such a great sense of humor. So, you know, it's a good thing to have those folky things as well as the academic things within the collection. So that's great. Well, we are just at this little bit over the hour mark. So I want to thank you so much, Kevin, again, for always being one of our Trouble Weekend speakers, and for the second time now over the pandemic, inviting us into your home to see your collection. I think the first time we did this, I told you, I don't care if anybody else watches, I want to see it. And that holds true, but I'm so glad so many were able to join us tonight. And I can't thank you enough, and I can't thank Donna enough for being your wonderful camera woman. So it's been such a pleasure. Thank you. And